Hello. Welcome back to the Happy Heat Pump Show. Everything you want to know about heat pumps. I'm Evan Davis, fascinated in heat pumps. Just a hobby though, not a BBC podcast. I'm with Bean Beanland of the Heat Pump Federation. He's a director there, knows everything about heat pumps. And today, we thought we'd talk about money. A lot of people terrified, put off heat pumps by the cost of them. Bean, I hear a lot of different figures. You look up and you hear it's going to cost 15 grand to put in a heat pump. Then you look up or Google a heat pump and it says 2.5 grand, you can buy one. We need to get our heads around what is the cost of putting in a heat pump. Start us off.
So at the moment, we are in a period where we still have government support for deployment of domestic heat pumps. And that applies both in social housing and also in what government likes to call able to pay market. What we're talking about is the cost of the transition. So it upsets me when people say a heat pump's 5 times the price of a boiler. It isn't. The transition may be 4 or 5 times the cost of replacing a boiler, but the transition is a one-off cost. We've only got to do it once.
And that transition is insulating the property sufficiently?
No, not necessarily. So the transition will be putting in all the appropriate pipe work. So that the transition cost really does vary tremendously, because if your gas boiler is on an outside wall and directly outside is the appropriate location for your air to water heat pump, and all the pipe work is readily accessible and everything is appropriately sized, actually, which it should be, because of course your gas boiler should be running at 55 degrees, then the cost of transition can actually be terribly low, in which case you are looking at the cost of the device plus the labor and decommissioning gas. And the decommissioning of the gas has a cost to it, of course. But for most people, it's not quite that simple. There are other considerations. The heat pump can't be just on the other side of the wall of where the gas boiler is. You need to run new pipe work. In some instances, people will have to find room for a new hot water cylinder, because if you're displacing a combi boiler, and there are about 14 million homes in the UK with combi boilers, have no hot water cylinder. So the boiler is creating
Hot water tank, basically, where your hot water's going.
Yeah, so the combi boiler is creating the hot water instantaneously as you use it, so you don't have any storage.
Later heat pump podcast topic there, the hot water. We definitely need to talk about hot water. Today, money. So it's as long as a piece of string. You'll obviously have to get a good installer. You'll obviously have to get a configuration spec'd up, and someone will tell you how much it's going to cost. But let's just go through it. Then you've got the cost of the heat pump, which is comparable to a good gas boiler, a large gas boiler.
Probably 50% or a bit more than a equivalent gas boiler. But it does come with all the controls, whereas the gas boilers probably don't come with the controls. We tend to use them in a very badly controlled way.
Not an order of magnitude more, but more. Then you've got configuring the house to be piped up in all the right way. You might use it as a chance to get rid of radiators and put air blowers on the walls, for example. That'll be extra. You'll have the installation, which is you'll have with a gas boiler anyway, but you'll have probably a bit more of that to be done. Once you've done that, the heat pump can be replaced without having to do it all again.
Correct.
But the one that everybody talks about is the cost of insulating the house so that it is heat pump ready. Now, you're going to tell me, I'm not here to sell anything. You, I think, are slightly here to sell heat pumps, about which you're very enthusiastic. You're going to tell me you don't have to insulate the house. But you do have to insulate the house, because the heat pump isn't generating heat at a very high temperatures. If you don't insulate the house will lose the heat as quickly as you're putting it in.
No, you see, you fall into the trap again. You just said the heat pump doesn't generate the heat at such a high temperature. I thought we'd tackled this in the previous episode, Evan. No. The question now is fabric first or fabric second. So if we were running our gas boilers properly, we would be running them at a flow temperature of 55 degrees, so they're in condensing mode most of the time. To do that, we need the correctly sized radiators. I don't like the term oversizing, because it's not oversizing, it's correctly sizing. And in an ideal world, to reduce our energy consumption, our primary energy consumption, we would insulate our buildings. We are terrible at insulating our buildings in the UK. And historically, I think that's because the fuels that we've been using have, for most people, been too cheap. There are lots of people who are in comfort poverty. I don't like the term fuel poverty, so comfort poverty. I absolutely get that. But for many of us, the gas we've been burning for decades has been pretty cheap.
And it's made us very relaxed about it.
Yeah, and we're wasteful. There's enough waste heat in London. We're sitting in residential London. There's enough waste heat in London to heat 750,000 homes.
Okay. I mean, but this is still taking it away. It is, most people are going to install a heat pump system which will be operating at a relatively low temperature, and it will be replacing a gas boiler that has been operating, for better or worse, at a high temperature, and the low temperature will work better in an insulated home. So you probably want to insulate your home well. I mean, and obviously you probably want to do that with a gas boiler.
You should do that with a gas boiler. I mean, that's the first point. The primary point to get across here is that insulation is good for all heat sources. And actually, the building doesn't know where the heat's coming from. So the building doesn't recognize it. But as a minimum, really, people should be doing loft insulation. They should
more than that.
They should potentially be considering cavity wall insulation, although that does come with some caveats. Draft proofing is the one that people frequently miss, because draft in buildings is a bit like wind chill for you and I when we're outside. Drafts will strip heat from buildings very quickly. So if you've done loft insulation, relatively low cost, relatively easy to do, you've done some draft proofing, low cost, relatively easy to do. Most people have probably got double glazing by now. Actually, you've done a pretty good job. There are lots of other things you could do, but you've done a pretty good job. So actually, the additional costs of insulating, unless you're doing a complete rebuild.
Well, if you are renovating, you can put insulating heat insulation on the inside of the wall, and it's going to be better than it was before, and all of that. Okay, so let's talk dosh. Let us suppose it's a 3-bedroom house with radiators already. You're going to replace the gas boiler with air to water heat pump system. I mean, what's the sort of, let's suppose it's reasonably well insulated. There may be a little bit you want to do, but what is the budget you need?
So we got some data, I'm pleased to say, and we like data.
Okay, go on.
So the government currently has the Boiler Upgrade Scheme, which is the supporting grant mechanism for domestic heat pumps. The total cost data is being...
I don't want the grants yet. Give me the grant data. I want the cost, the actual
This
cost.
is where the data is coming from.
Yeah.
Okay. So under the scheme, we're collecting the capital cost of the project.
Okay.
The average price at the moment in that scheme is around £12,500.
12,500. So half of the houses are more, half of them are less than that. But that's it.
Yeah.
And most of that, I think, from what you've said, most of the 12.5 is the one-off cost.
Correct.
Not the regular cost.
Absolutely right. Yes. So it's the cost of the transition. Now, in a much smaller home, clearly it's going to be lower. And because of the size of the grant, that is where you get the differential in people paying. Actually, the sum that the consumer has to pay can vary enormously, because if it's a small system, very easy to install, everything is just clicking into place, then the amount of money over and above the grant can be relatively small. Clearly, if you're at the other end of the scale, then you've got to provide a bit more capital.
So we're recording this. We hope that this will last for thousands of years, this podcast. We're recording it in 2024. There is a scheme by which the government will subsidise your heat pump. Obviously, we're paying for that through taxes. So, but you can get some grants to help with the cost.
Yeah, so the current grant scheme is the Boiler Upgrade Scheme. Slightly odd name, but I'm told that the acronym BUS, the concept of getting on the bus, was perceived to be a good one.
Clear.
So we have the Boiler Upgrade Scheme. That is a one-off grant, and it's currently worth £7,500 per household. And it's claimed by the installer. So it's a very easy mechanism for the homeowner. Homeowner doesn't have to do anything. The installer does all the work. And effectively, the homeowner pays the capital cost of the project less the £7,500 discount. The installer then claims the claims the value of the voucher.
So an average house might be $5,000 after the
It
could be that. Yeah, okay. Well, that's interesting. Now there's a Swedish company, Era, I think that's how you say it, or Iera.
That is correct.
Who I think their distinctive thing is they'll basically pay for it up front, and you're essentially renting it, like people used to actually when color TVs came, and I'm old enough to remember this.
Yeah.
They were quite a big capital outlay, a color TV.
Yeah, radio rentals was on every high street, along with the gas shop was what's on every high street, and the electricity
You
shop.
rented your color TV, and everybody rented. That was the absolute norm.
And washing machines.
Era, I think, are proposing that model. That must, to me, it seems like that must catch on. That you basically get someone else to pay.
Yeah,
and you pay a
the
rent.
brands are available.
But do other ones do the sort of financing thing?
Fundamentally, people are going to pay for this by releasing capital one way or another. So a leasing model is effectively them saying, I'm going to take some cash out of my sort of monthly outgoings. Someone might extend their mortgage. There are other ways of doing it. Yeah, and pay a bit more on the mortgage. And there's a lot of talk about green mortgages. But fundamentally, people are going to find a way of releasing the capital now and then paying for it over time. Most people don't pay cash for their boilers these days. A boiler replacement, many of those are being done on schemes where they're being paid off over an extended period of time. So this is not new territory for heating devices. There are other brands, I should say, apart from Era, like Google. There are other people looking at these models. And this is part of how we are going to pay for these things.
I'm sure.
So I was with a community group last week. I said to them, show of hands, how many of you have converted your house, put central heating into your house? Nobody, because it's already been done. We have put central heating in. The reason why I mentioned this, of course, is the capital cost of putting in central heating is enormous because your floorboards up, plaster off the walls. I mean, it really is disruptive and very expensive. We've all done it. So the previous generations did all that.
It was not standard. People should be reminded. Central heating was not a standard thing in homes after the Second World War.
The point of this is that it was all self-funded. And at the time when the first buildings were being done, everyone said, oh, it's too expensive. That's only for rich people. That'll never catch on.
It does catch on eventually. Well, it is interesting because I think you should be worried as a heat pump salesperson, and not direct, but an ambassador for the heat pump industry. I think you should worry that the perception is heat pumps are for rich people.
Yes, that is certainly something the industry has to guard against. But you've got to remember that all households, regardless of wealth, have already got heat pumps. They've all got fridges. Yeah, people who've got a car sitting outside, that's probably got air conditioning in it. So I think you're right. Right now, it is a challenging time, particularly given the current financial circumstances. It is a challenging time, but I do think that we will find ways of getting the capital to the people who want it in an affordable way. The EV market is already doing this. The electric vehicle market is doing this.
Let's see. It's a very interesting proposition. My own view of this, though, Bean, actually, is that I think most homes, have a sort of a fairly thorough renovation every 30 years, let's say. Someone buys them, they rip out the kitchen, maybe reconfigure the walls, put an extension on. A pretty big renovation every 30 years. If you do the conversion at that time, I think it's much easier than if you do it just on Tuesday afternoon. Let's put a heat pump in and put all the pipes in. I mean, that you can do a bit of insulating. You might want to upgrade that. You can put the pipes in and decorate. I think we should think about this as a sort of, if you're renovating, you should be thinking about how you're configuring your heating for the next 30 years. That's how
That's a good trigger point.
Yeah.
The other trigger point, of course, is as the boiler comes up to needing to replacement. And at the moment, we have a scenario in the UK where 70% of boiler replacements are what we call distressed purchases. Boilers failed. What do I do? So we are actually working with a number of others in the industry to try and tackle that by encouraging consumers to think about what they're going to do next in advance.
Okay, so plan ahead, and particularly useful if you're doing a renovation to think about it then. I think we should leave it there. We promised bite-sized chunks, and I think that's a big enough bite that we've been talking about. We've got lots on this podcast to get through. We can talk about flats, we can talk about hot water, we can talk about installers, we can talk about noises, loads we'll be talking about. In the meantime, though, do leave a like, a comment, subscribe, email us at happyheatpumppod@gmail.com, and join us next time.